In the dust-choked hills of New Mexico territory, Clara Bellamy stepped off the wagon, expecting to meet her promised husband. Instead, she found an abandoned ranch and a grave marker, still fresh with dirt. The rancher, who'd written her letters, filled with hope, had been gunned down weeks before her arrival, leaving nothing but windswept ruins and whispered warnings from townsfolk about cursed land. With winter approaching and no money for passage home, Clara made a choice that would change everything. She swept the broken glass from the windows, scrubbed blood stains from the floorboards, and decided to make the dead man's ranch her own. Then Boone Carrigan rode in, a wealthy cattle baron with silver spurs and a reputation for taking what he wanted. He'd come to claim the land, but found something far more valuable. What happens when a woman with nothing to lose meets a man who has everything to protect? Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from. And if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The letter had arrived on a Tuesday morning in March, when the Boston streets still held winter's bite, and Clara's boarding house room felt smaller than a coffin. She'd read Thomas McKinnon's words so many times the paper had grown soft as cloth. Between her fingers, "Dear Miss Bellamy," it began in careful script. "I hope this correspondence finds you in good health and spirits. Your advertisement in the Boston Herald spoke to my heart in ways I hadn't expected. A woman of good character, seeking honest work, and perhaps companionship in the territories. Sounds like exactly what this lonely rancher needs." Clara had placed that advertisement 3 months after burying her husband Samuel, when the consumption finally claimed him and left her with nothing but debts and the bitter taste of a Boston winter that seemed to last forever. At 28, she was too old to be anyone's fresh young bride, too proud to throw herself on the mercy of distant relatives who'd never approved of her marriage to a shopkeeper's son. The train journey west had taken 4 days, each mile carrying her further from the soot-stained tenements and closer to something that felt like hope. Thomas's letters had painted pictures of wide skies and clean air, of a small ranch where a woman could grow vegetables and maybe keep chickens, where the silence wasn't filled with the coughing of sick neighbors or the constant rattle of factory machinery. "I won't lie to you," one letter had read. "Life out here is hard, and I'm not a wealthy man. But I've got 160 acres of good grazing land, a sturdy house, and the kind of loneliness that makes a man appreciate what he's got when he finally gets it. If you're willing to take a chance on a stranger, I promise to be the kind of husband who values your partnership more than your compliance." Those words had decided her. Clara had sold her few remaining possessions, bought a train ticket to Albuquerque, and arranged for passage on the supply wagon that ran monthly to the smaller settlements. She'd packed her mother's china teacups, her sewing basket, 3 decent dresses, and Samuel's Bible, everything that remained of the life she was leaving behind. The wagon driver, a weathered man named Pete Garrison, had grown increasingly quiet as they'd climbed into the high country. When Clara asked about Thomas McKinnon, Pete had spit tobacco juice over the wagon's side and muttered something about bad business and worse timing. "Probably should have sent word," he'd said finally, "but figured it wasn't my place." Now, standing in the doorway of what should have been her new home, Clara understood his reluctance. The ranch house sat in a natural hollow between 2 ridges, protected from the worst winds, but exposed to anyone approaching from the main trail. It had been built solid, thick adobe walls, a proper stone foundation, real glass windows instead of oiled paper. But violence had visited here recently. The front door hung crooked on its hinges. Dark stains marked the wooden porch where someone had bled heavily. Inside, furniture lay overturned, and bullet holes had shattered one window. Yet beneath the damage, Clara could see the care Thomas had taken. Hand-hewn shelves lined one wall. A stone fireplace dominated the main room, with a mantel carved in simple but elegant patterns. The kitchen held a proper cast-iron stove and a pump that still brought clear water from a well. She found Thomas's letters to her in a wooden box beside his bed, tied with a piece of string. Her own letters were there too, the ones she'd sent describing her life in Boston, her hopes for their future together. Seeing her own handwriting in this place where she'd never expected to be alone made her throat close with unexpected grief. Outside, the November wind carried the scent of coming snow. Clara wrapped Samuel's old coat tighter around her shoulders and walked the boundaries of what Thomas had tried to leave her. The ranch spread across a natural valley, with good grass for cattle, and a stream that ran year-round. She could see why he'd chosen this place, and why someone might have killed him for it. The nearest neighbor was 5 miles down the mountain. The town of Cedar Falls was another 10 miles beyond that. She had $17 in her reticule, enough food for perhaps a week, and no clear way to return to Boston even if she'd wanted to. Which Clara realized with surprise she didn't. Standing there in the growing darkness, with the wind singing through the broken window and mice scurrying in the walls, Clara made the decision that would reshape her life. She would stay. She would repair what could be fixed, clean what could be cleaned, and find a way to make this abandoned place into the home she'd traveled so far to claim. That first night, she barricaded the broken door with an overturned table, lit a fire in the stone hearth, and wrote by candlelight in the journal she'd kept since Samuel's death, November 15th, 1887. I am further from Boston than I ever imagined possible, in a house that smells of violence and loneliness, but something in me has awakened that I thought died with Samuel. Tomorrow, I begin again. Clara woke to sunlight streaming through the one unbroken window and the sound of her own chattering teeth. The fire had died sometime in the night, and frost covered the inside of the glass where her breath had frozen. She pulled Samuel's coat over her nightgown and padded barefoot to the kitchen, where she discovered Thomas McKinnon's final gift, a larder still stocked with enough provisions to last through winter. Canned peaches, beans, and tomatoes lined the shelves. Sacks of flour and cornmeal sat sealed against mice. A side of bacon hung in the root cellar, along with potatoes that had sprouted but were still edible. Clara touched each item with something approaching reverence. Thomas had prepared for her. Arrival with the thoroughness of a man who understood frontier life, even as death stalked him. In the bedroom, she found his personal effects arranged with military precision. A daguerreotype of a stern-faced woman, his mother, perhaps, sat beside a leather-bound Bible. The Bible's pages fell open naturally to Psalm 23, and Clara saw that the margins were filled with Thomas's handwriting, notes about faith and perseverance, that suggested a man who'd wrestled with doubt and found his own answers. But it was the bloodstains on the Bible's leather cover that told the real story. Dark brown now, they spoke of Thomas's final moments, of a man who'd reached for comfort in his dying and found it in familiar words. Clara's hands trembled as she read his marginalia. The Lord is my shepherd, I shall not want, even when men's hearts turn to violence, his love remains constant. Below that, in fresher ink, November 3rd, Clara arrives next week, must finish the fence repairs, want everything perfect for her. The date meant Thomas had died only days before she'd arrived, still working to prepare for the life they'd planned together. Clara closed the Bible gently and held it against her chest, feeling the weight of a stranger's hopes and dreams. Outside, the morning revealed the scope of Thomas's work and the violence that had ended it. The ranch showed signs of careful stewardship, fenced, pastures, a vegetable garden gone to seed, but still showing neat rows, a chicken coop built solid enough to withstand mountain weather. But bullet holes scarred the barn door, and drag marks in the dirt suggested Thomas's body had been moved after the shooting. Clara walked the property boundaries, following fence lines that Thomas had repaired with obvious pride. The ranch sat in a natural bowl surrounded by pine-covered ridges with good grass and the stream running clear through the middle. It was beautiful country, the kind of place that could make a person understand why men fought over land. At the far end of the property, she found Thomas's grave. The wooden marker was simple, Thomas McKinnon, 1845–1887, he tried to do right. Someone had taken the trouble to bury him properly, though Clara couldn't imagine who. The grave was too neat for hasty work, too careful for enemies. "You deserve better," she said aloud, surprised by the sound of her own voice in the mountain silence. We both did. The ride into Cedar Falls took her most of the morning, following a wagon track that wound through stands of aspen and pine. She'd found Thomas's mare in the pasture, a gentle bay who seemed grateful for attention after days of solitude. Clara had never been much of a rider, but necessity made her brave. Cedar Falls proved to be a collection of weathered buildings clustered around a single main street. The general store, saloon and post office shared the same ramshackle quality as frontier towns everywhere. Men in dusty clothes watched her ride past with the frank curiosity of people who knew everyone's business. Martha Henley, who ran the general store with her husband Jim, was the first to speak plainly about Thomas's death. "Shot down like a dog," Martha said, her weathered hands folding and refolding a piece of calico. "3 men came calling after midnight. Poor Thomas never had a chance." "Why?" Clara asked. "What did he do?" "Nothing but refuse to sell his land to the wrong people," Jim Henley said from behind the counter. "Jake Morrison's been buying up every ranch in this valley, making offers that ain't really offers, if you take my meaning." Clara's stomach tightened. "What kind of offers?" "The kind where you sell, or accidents happen," Martha said grimly. "Thomas was stubborn, said he had a bride coming and wouldn't be run off his own land. Morrison didn't take kindly to being told no." "Where is Morrison now?" The Henleys exchanged glances. "Runs cattle on the big spread south of here," Jim said carefully. "Got more money than sense and a reputation for settling disputes permanent-like." Clara bought supplies with Thomas's money, nails and boards to fix the door, glass to replace. The broken window, ammunition for the rifle she'd found in his bedroom. The Henleys watched her with expressions that mixed admiration and pity. "You planning to stay out there?" Martha asked as she wrapped Clara's purchases. "It's my home now," Clara said, surprised by the certainty in her own voice. "Thomas's home." Jim corrected gently. "Thomas is dead," Clara replied. "The home needs someone living." Clara was hammering boards over the broken window when she heard the horses. 3 riders approached from the South Trail, moving with the unhurried confidence of men who owned whatever they surveyed. She set down her hammer and wiped sawdust from her hands, watching them through the gap in the boards. The lead rider commanded attention without effort. Tall in the saddle, with dark hair touched by silver at the temples, and a bearing that suggested both wealth and danger. His horse was a magnificent black stallion that probably cost more than most men made in a year. Silver conchos, decorated. His saddle and his belt buckle caught the afternoon sun like a signal mirror. The other 2 men flanked him at a respectful distance. Hired hands, Clara realized, not equals. They sat their horses with the easy alertness of men accustomed to trouble. The lead rider dismounted with fluid grace and approached the porch where Clara stood. Up close, she could see the quality of his clothes. Hand-tooled leather boots, a coat cut from fine wool, everything bearing the mark of money and taste, but his eyes held the hardness of a man who'd earned his position through more than inheritance. "Ma'am," he said, touching his hat brim. His voice carried the educated accent of the East, though years in the territories had roughened its edges. "I'm Boone Carrigan. I believe there's been some confusion about this property." Clara kept her expression neutral, though her heart hammered against her ribs. "What kind of confusion?" "The kind that happens when dead men can't defend their claims." Boone's smile was polite, but didn't reach his eyes. "Thomas McKinnon owed me money, substantial money. This ranch stands as collateral for that debt. I haven't seen any papers to that effect." Boone reached inside his coat. Slowly, Clara noted, aware of her eyes on him, and withdrew a folded document. The paper was heavy stock, with official seals and signatures. Clara's hands remained steady as she examined it, though the legal language might as well have been written in Chinese. "This appears to be a loan agreement," she said carefully, "dated 6 months ago. Thomas needed capital to expand his operation. I provided it, with the understanding that failure to repay would result in forfeiture of the property." Boone's tone was conversational, as if discussing the weather. "His death, unfortunate though it was, doesn't absolve the debt." Clara folded the paper and handed it back. "I'm Clara Bellamy. I was to be Thomas's wife. My condolences on your loss." Boone's expression softened slightly. "But surely you understand this changes nothing regarding the legal situation." "Legal?" Clara laughed, surprising herself with the bitterness in the sound. "Thomas was murdered for refusing to sell his land. If that's legal in these parts, I've misjudged the territory entirely." Something shifted in Boone's face, a flicker of surprise, perhaps even respect. Murder is a serious accusation. Murder is a serious crime. Ask anyone in Cedar Falls who killed Thomas McKinnon and why. One of the hired hands shifted in his saddle, and Clara caught the movement from the corner of her eye. Boone raised a hand slightly, and the man settled back. "Miss Bellamy," Boone said, his voice taking on a different quality, "you strike me as an intelligent woman, intelligent enough to recognize an untenable situation when you see one. I see a woman with nowhere else to go, standing on property that needs care." Clara met his gaze directly. "I see a man with enough money to buy a dozen ranches, wanting to take the one place I might call home. And I see a woman alone, in dangerous country, with winter coming and enemies she doesn't fully understand." Boone's words carried warning, not threat. Jake Morrison killed Thomas McKinnon, though proving it would be difficult. Morrison wants this land, and he's not particular about who stands in his way. Clara's breath caught. "You know Morrison killed Thomas. I know Morrison kills anyone who interferes with his plans. I know he's been consolidating this entire valley under his control. And I know a lone woman, no matter how determined, won't survive what he has planned. So your solution is to steal the ranch yourself." "My solution is to own it legally before Morrison takes it by force." Boone's eyes were steady on hers. "The difference between us, Miss Bellamy, is that I don't kill women." Clara felt the truth of that statement in her bones. Whatever Boone Carrigan might be, he wasn't Jake Morrison, but that didn't make him her savior. "What exactly are you proposing?" she asked. "Pack your belongings. I'll provide transportation back to civilization and enough money to start over somewhere safer." "And if I refuse?" Boone was quiet for a long moment, studying her face with eyes that seemed to see more than she was comfortable revealing. When he spoke, his voice held something that might have been admiration. "Then I suppose we'll discover just how stubborn a Boston woman can be." Clara straightened her shoulders and looked directly at the man who held her future in his hands. "I'm not leaving." Boone nodded slowly, as if her answer confirmed something he'd already suspected. "In that case, Miss Bellamy, we appear to have a problem." Boone Carrigan didn't leave. That was Clara's first surprise. Her second was waking the next morning to find him repairing the barn door. His fine coat hung on a fence post, and his sleeves rolled up like any common laborer. "What are you doing?" she called from the porch, where she'd emerged with Thomas's rifle in her hands and suspicion in her voice. "Fixing what's broken," Boone replied without looking up from his work. His movements were efficient, practiced, clearly. Not his first time handling tools. "Property deteriorates quickly in this climate." "Your property, you mean?" "Someone's property." He set down his hammer and turned to face her. In the morning light, without his coat and hat, he looked less like a wealthy cattle baron and more like a man accustomed to hard work. "The question is whether it gets fixed or falls down while we argue about ownership." Clara lowered the rifle, but didn't set it aside. "We're not arguing. You showed me papers. I don't have papers. You win. If I'd wanted to simply claim the property, Miss Bellamy, you'd have found yourself homeless yesterday evening." Boone picked up a board and examined it for warping. "The fact that you're still here suggests the situation is more complicated." "Complicated how?" "You interest me." The simple statement hung in the air between them. Clara felt heat rise in. her cheeks and blamed the morning sun. "I don't understand. Most women in your position would have accepted my offer of transportation and funds. You refused. Most people facing overwhelming odds choose retreat. You chose to stand and fight." Boone's eyes met hers across the barnyard. "That suggests either remarkable courage or remarkable foolishness. I prefer to think of it as stubbornness, a quality I appreciate." Boone returned to his hammering. "It's also likely to get you killed if Jake Morrison decides you're in his way." Clara watched him work, noting the precision of his movements, the way he tested each board before nailing it in place. Whatever else Boone Carrigan might be, he wasn't afraid of honest labor. "Why do you care what happens to me?" she asked finally. Boone paused in his work. "I've spent the better part of 20 years acquiring property, building my holdings, expanding my influence. In all that time, I've never met anyone who stood up to me the way you did yesterday, and that appeals to you. It intrigues me." He set down his hammer and faced her fully. "I've been thinking about your situation, Miss Bellamy, and mine. What about your situation? I own more land than any man has a right to. I employ 40 cowboys, control the largest cattle operation in 3 territories, and have enough money to buy whatever I want." Boone's expression was unreadable. "But I don't have anyone who challenges me, anyone who sees me as something other than a source of employment or a business opportunity." Clara felt her grip tighten on the rifle. "What are you suggesting?" "A partnership." "What kind of partnership?" "You need legal protection and financial backing. I need—" Boone paused, as if searching for the right words. "Purpose, perhaps. Something beyond simply accumulating more of what I already have too much of." Clara studied his face, looking for signs of deception or mockery. She found neither, only a kind of weary honesty that surprised her. "You're proposing we work together." "I'm proposing we see what happens when an unstoppable force meets an immovable object." Boone's smile was genuine this time, transforming his stern features. "You can stay on the ranch. Help me turn it into something Thomas McKinnon would have been proud of. In exchange, you have my protection against Morrison and anyone else who might threaten you. And what do you get out of this arrangement? The chance to find out if a Boston woman can teach an old cowboy new tricks." Clara was quiet for a long moment, weighing his words against everything she'd learned about frontier survival. Boone Carrigan was dangerous, that much was clear. But he was also offering her something no one else could, a chance to stay, to build the life she'd traveled so far to find. "I have conditions," she said finally. "I'd be disappointed if you didn't. I'm not your employee. If we're partners, we're equals." "Agreed. I keep Thomas's name on the grave marker. This was his dream first, of course. And if you ever lie to me about anything important, the partnership ends immediately." Boone was quiet for a moment, and Clara saw something flicker across his features, surprise, perhaps, or respect. "You drive a hard bargain, Miss Bellamy. I've learned that anything worth having requires fighting for." Boone extended his hand across the space between them. "Partners, then." Clara set the rifle against the porch railing and shook his hand. His grip was firm, calloused from years of ranch work despite his obvious wealth. "Partners," she agreed, wondering if she was making the best decision of her life or the worst mistake she'd ever survive. The first test of their partnership came 3 days later, when Clara found the injured calf. She'd been checking the fence line along the stream. When she heard the pitiful bawling, the animal had somehow gotten itself tangled in old barbed wire, probably left over from Thomas's earlier fencing attempts. Blood matted the calf's white coat, and panic had made the wounds worse as it struggled against the wire. "Easy, baby," Clara murmured, approaching slowly. The calf rolled its eyes and tried to pull away, but exhaustion had taken most of the fight out of it. Clara could see the wire had cut deep into its front leg. She was still working to free the animal when Boone arrived, drawn by the sound of distress. He dismounted and approached carefully, taking in the situation with the quick assessment of an experienced rancher. "Hold still," he said quietly, though Clara wasn't sure if he was talking to her or the calf. He produced a pair of wire cutters from his saddlebags and began working on the tangle with steady precision. "Is it yours?" Clara asked, keeping her voice low to avoid spooking the animal further. "Probably. My herd grazes the south pasture." Boone's hands were gentle as he worked the wire free. But ownership doesn't matter much to a hurt animal. Together, they managed to extract the calf from its wire prison. The leg wound was ugly, but not life-threatening, Clara judged. She'd seen worse injuries during the cholera outbreak in Boston, when she'd helped tend the sick in their tenement building. "We need to clean this," she said, examining the cuts, "and bandage it properly or infection will set in." Boone looked at her with surprise. "You know about doctoring animals?" "I know about doctoring wounds." Clara straightened, wiping blood from her hands on her apron. "Flesh is flesh, whether it walks on 2 legs or 4. They carried the calf back to the ranch house, where Clara set about cleaning and dressing the wounds with supplies from Thomas's well-stocked medical kit. Boone watched her work with growing interest, noting the sure way she handled the frightened animal, the gentle competence of her movements. "Where did you learn to do this?" he asked, as Clara wrapped clean bandages around the calf's leg. "Boston." Clara's voice was matter-of-fact. "When you're poor and live in crowded places, you learn to tend what needs tending. Doctors cost money. Most people don't have. And your husband? Did he appreciate having a wife who could doctor wounds?" Clara's hands stilled for a moment on the bandage. "Samuel was traditional in his thinking. He preferred I leave the healing to men with proper training, even when those men weren't available. Especially then." Clara's voice carried old hurt. "He thought it unseemly for a woman to involve herself in such matters." Boone was quiet for a moment, processing this information. When he spoke, his voice held a note of puzzlement. "Seems to me a man would be grateful to have a capable partner." Clara looked up from her work, meeting his eyes directly. "Samuel believed a woman's capabilities should be limited. Limited how? To keeping house, bearing children, and deferring to male judgment in all important matters." Clara finished tying the bandage and stood, brushing hay from her skirt. "He loved me, in his way, but he never saw me as an equal." Boone lifted the now calm calf and carried it to a pen where it could recover safely. When he returned, he found Clara washing her hands at the pump, her expression thoughtful. "Is that why you answered Thomas's advertisement?" he asked. "To find a different kind of husband?" Thomas wrote about partnership. Clara dried her hands on a clean towel. "About valuing a woman's contributions." It sounded refreshing. "And now?" Clara looked around the ranch, at the repaired barn, the cleaned house, the pen where the injured calf rested comfortably. "Now I'm discovering what it feels like to have my capabilities appreciated rather than merely tolerated." Boone reached up and unfastened his belt buckle, an ornate silver piece that Clara had noticed but never examined closely. He held it out to her, and she saw it bore an intricate engraving of a running horse surrounded by flowing script. "My grandfather's," he said simply. "He came west with nothing but determination and a belief that a man should be judged by what he builds, not what he inherits." Boone's fingers traced the engraving. "He married my grandmother when she was running a boarding house in Denver. She was considered scandalous, a woman in business for herself. What happened to them? They built the largest ranch in Colorado Territory. Together." Boone refastened the buckle and looked at Clara. "Grandfather always said the secret was finding a partner strong enough to challenge you and wise enough to trust you." Clara felt something shift in her chest. A loosening of old hurts, perhaps, or the first stirring of new possibilities. "Your grandmother sounds like a remarkable woman." "She was, and she would have liked you very much." Boone's smile was warm, genuine. "You have the same stubborn streak." That evening, they shared their first real meal together at the kitchen table Clara had repaired and polished. As Boone told stories of his grandmother's business acumen and his grandfather's adventures, Clara found herself relaxing in ways she hadn't since Samuel's death. The confession came on a cold November evening. 3 weeks after their partnership began, Clara was mending one of Boone's shirts by lamplight when she noticed him staring into the fire with an expression she'd learned to recognize, the look of a man wrestling with memories he'd rather forget. "You don't have to tell me," she said quietly, not looking up from her needlework. "But sometimes talking helps lighten the load." Boone was quiet for so long she thought he might not respond. Then he reached into his vest pocket and withdrew something small and gold, a wedding ring worn thin by years of handling. "Her name was Catherine," he said, his voice barely above a whisper. "We married when I was 22, full of plans to build an empire together." Clara's hands stilled on the mending. She'd wondered about Boone's past, about why a man of his obvious qualities remained unmarried, but she'd never pressed. Now, seeing the pain in his eyes as he turned the ring between his fingers, she understood. "She died in childbirth," Boone continued. "Both of them, Catherine and our son. The doctor said sometimes these things just happen, that no one was to blame." He laughed bitterly. Easy words for a man who didn't have to bury his whole future in one grave. Clara set down her sewing and moved to the chair beside his. "How long ago?" 15 years this December. Boone slipped the ring back into his pocket. "I told myself I'd honor her memory by never taking another wife. Seemed romantic at the time, the grieving widower who loved too deeply to love again. And now I think it was just cowardice dressed up as devotion." Boone's eyes met hers across the firelight. "I was afraid to risk that kind of loss again, so I convinced myself I was being noble." Clara understood the weight of such fear. She reached up and touched the base of her throat, where a small cameo brooch rested against her dress, her mother's, worn every day since the woman's death when Clara was 16. "I was married before Samuel," she said, surprising herself with the admission, "to a boy named James who worked in my father's shop. We were 18 and thought we knew everything about love." Boone waited, sensing there was more to the story. "James died in a factory accident 6 months after our wedding, crushed when a beam fell." Clara's fingers worried the cameo's edge. "I thought my life was over. Samuel was safe, kind enough, but safe. I married him because I couldn't bear the thought of losing someone I truly loved again. But you didn't love Samuel." "I loved him," Clara said carefully, "but not the way I loved James. Not the way that makes your heart race and your hands shake and your whole world feel bigger and brighter." She looked at Boone directly. "Samuel was a good man, but he never made me feel alive the way James did." "Do you regret it?" "The safe choice." Clara considered the question, weighing honesty against comfort. "I regret that I let fear make my choices. For me, I regret that I spent 8 years being grateful for kindness instead of hoping for passion." They sat in comfortable silence for a while, watching the fire burn down to embers. Finally, Boone reached over and touched her hand where it rested on the chair arm. "I'm glad you came here," he said simply. Clara felt her pulse quicken at the contact. "Even though I've complicated your orderly life?" "Especially because of that." Boone's thumb traced across her knuckles. "I'd forgotten what it felt like to look forward to something instead of just enduring it." Clara turned her hand over, palm up, and let their fingers intertwine. The gesture was simple, but it carried the weight of 2 hearts that had been too careful for too long. "Boone," she said softly, "what are we doing?" "I don't know," he admitted, "but I know I don't want to stop." Clara felt the truth of that statement in her bones. Whatever was growing between them was dangerous in ways that had nothing to do with Jake Morrison or land disputes. This was the kind of danger that could crack open carefully guarded hearts and leave them vulnerable to the kind of loss they'd both sworn to avoid. "I'm scared," she whispered. "Good," Boone said, his voice rough with emotion. "That means it matters." He leaned closer, and Clara could smell the pine soap he used, could see the flecks of gold in his brown eyes. For a moment, she thought he might kiss her. For a moment, she wanted him to. Instead, he brought her hand to his lips and pressed a gentle kiss to her palm. "We'll take this slow," he promised. "Whatever this is, Wherever it leads, we'll be careful with each other." Clara nodded, not trusting her voice. But as she prepared for bed that night, she caught herself humming, something she hadn't done since James died. The sound surprised her, a reminder that her heart was still capable of hope, still willing to risk the possibility of joy. Outside her window, the first snow of winter began to fall, covering the ranch in pristine white. A fresh start, Clara thought, for the land, and perhaps for them. The wanted poster arrived with the mail wagon on a Tuesday morning that started peaceful and turned dangerous before Clara had finished her coffee. Pete Garrison handed her the weekly delivery with his usual taciturn nod, but she noticed how his eyes lingered on Boone, who was breaking horses in the far corral. "Something troubling you, Pete?" Clara asked, sorting through letters in the territorial newspaper. "Might be nothing," Pete said, spitting tobacco juice over the wagon's side. "But there's talk in Albuquerque, federal marshals asking questions about Boone Carrigan." Clara's hands stilled on the mail. "What kind of questions?" "The kind that get answered with bullets or handcuffs." Pete gathered his reins. "Just thought you should know, in case you're getting too comfortable with your arrangement." After Pete left, Clara found herself staring at the newspaper with growing unease. Buried on the third page, between advertisements for patent medicines and notices of cattle auctions, she found what had Pete worried. "Wanted for questioning," read the headline above a sketch that captured Boone's strong features with unsettling accuracy. Boone Carrigan, also known as Raven, wanted in connection with the deaths of 3 men in Tombstone, Arizona Territory. Last seen in New Mexico Territory. Considered armed and extremely dangerous. The paper trembled in Clara's hands as she read. The details. The men had been shot down in broad daylight outside the Oriental Saloon, victims of what witnesses described as the fastest draw they'd ever seen. The article mentioned that Carrigan had been provoked, something about cheating at cards and threats against his person, but the law apparently made no distinction between justified killing and murder. Clara walked slowly toward the corral, the wanted poster folded in her apron pocket like a lead weight. Boone was working with a young stallion, his movements fluid and patient as he gentled the animal to accept a saddle. Watching him, Clara found it hard to reconcile the careful horseman with the deadly gunfighter described in the newspaper. "Boone!" she called when he paused to wipe sweat from his forehead. He looked up and immediately noticed her expression. "What's wrong?" Clara pulled out the poster without speaking. Boone's face went carefully blank as he read, showing no surprise, only the resigned acceptance of a man who'd been waiting for this moment. "When?" he asked simply. "6 months ago. Tombstone." Boone handed back the poster and resumed working with the horse, though Clara noticed the subtle way his right hand now rested closer to his gun belt. "Are you going to ask if I did it?" he said without looking at her. "Did you?" "Yes." The simple admission hit Clara like a physical blow. She'd known Boone was dangerous, had seen it in his eyes, in the way other men deferred to him, but knowing and confronting the reality were different things entirely. "Why?" she asked. Boone finally looked at her, and Clara saw something raw in his expression, old pain and newer fear. "Because they were going to kill me. Because 3 drunk cowboys decided a man with money was an easy target. Because I was faster than they were. The law sees it differently. The law wasn't there." Boone's voice carried bitter experience. "The law rarely is when these things happen." Clara felt the ground shifting beneath her feet. Everything she'd built with Boone, their partnership, their growing intimacy, her dreams of a peaceful future, suddenly seemed fragile as spun glass. "What does this mean for us?" she asked. "It means I should ride out tonight before I bring more trouble down on you." Boone's hands were gentle on the horse's neck, but Clara could see the tension in his shoulders. "It means you were right to be scared. Running away won't solve anything. Staying might get you killed." Boone turned to face her fully. "Jake, Morrison isn't the only threat anymore. Federal marshals, bounty hunters, anyone looking to make a name for themselves by bringing in the man they're calling Raven." Clara's mind raced. "Is that really your name? Raven?" It's what they called me in Tombstone, a nickname that stuck. Boone's smile was bitter. Seems appropriate for a man who brings death wherever he goes. That's not who you are here, isn't it? Boone gestured toward the poster. You've seen what I'm capable of, Clara. 3 men are dead because I was faster with a gun than they were. That's not something that changes just because I'm mending fences and gentling horses. Clara looked at the man she'd come to care for. This complex, dangerous, surprisingly gentle person who'd given her hope for a different kind of life. The smart thing would be to let him go, to protect herself from the violence that seemed to follow him like a shadow. Instead, she stepped closer and placed her hand on his arm. I'm not asking you to change who you are, she said quietly. I'm asking you to stay and let me decide what I can live with. Boone covered her hand with his, and Clara felt the slight tremor in his fingers. You don't know what you're asking. I know exactly what I'm asking. Clara met his eyes steadily. I'm asking you to trust me the way I'm trying to trust you. That night, as they sat by the fire with the wanted poster burning to ash in the grate, Clara wondered if love always required such leaps of faith. The attack came 3 nights later, just before dawn, when the world was painted in shades of grey and the air carried winter's sharp promise. Clara woke to the sound of breaking glass and men's voices harsh with drink and malice. "Carrigan!" someone shouted from the yard. "We know you're in there! Come out and face what's coming!" Clara rolled from her bed and grabbed Thomas's rifle from where she kept it beside the nightstand. Through her bedroom window, she could see 4 men on horseback, their faces hidden by hat brims and shadow. But their intent was clear enough. They'd come for Boone, drawn by the bounty on his head. "Stay down!" Boone's voice came from the hallway, calm and deadly. Clara could hear him moving through the house with the silent efficiency of a man who'd faced such situations before. "You in there, Raven?" Another voice called. "Worth $500 to bring you back to Tombstone. Dead or alive makes no difference to us." Clara crept to her bedroom door and found Boone crouched beside the front window, his Colt drawn and ready. In the pre-dawn darkness, he looked every inch the dangerous gunfighter described in the wanted poster. "How many?" she whispered. 4, maybe more in the trees. Boone's eyes never left the window. "Bounty hunters by the sound of them." A rifle shot cracked the morning air, and wood splinters exploded from the doorframe. Clara flinched but held. Her position, her own weapon steady in her hands. "This is what I was afraid of," Boone said, his voice heavy with self-recrimination. "I should have left before they found me." "Well, you didn't," Clara replied, surprised by her own steadiness. "So we deal with what is, not what should have been." Another shot shattered the kitchen window. Clara could hear the horses moving, the men positioning themselves for a siege. "Clara," Boone's voice was urgent. "There's a root cellar behind the kitchen. Stone walls, only one entrance. If things go bad, we face them together." Clara checked the rifle's action, grateful for the shooting lessons Thomas's letters had mentioned, but she'd never needed until now. "I didn't stay here to hide in cellars." Boone looked at her with something that might have been amazement. "You realize they'll kill you just for being here? Then we'd better make sure they don't get the chance." The next 20 minutes passed in a blur of gunfire and movement. The bounty hunters were professionals, but not particularly skilled ones. More accustomed to tracking isolated men than fighting entrenched defenders. Clara proved a better shot than anyone expected, her steady nerves and Thomas's well-maintained rifle accounting for one attacker's wounded shoulder and another's spooked horse. When the shooting finally stopped, 3 men lay dead in the yard, and the 4th had fled into the hills, bleeding and broken. Boone stood in the doorway, smoke curling from his Colt's barrel, his face grim with the knowledge of what would come next. "More will come," he said simply. "The bounty's too high, and now they know where to find me." Clara set down her rifle and walked to where he stood. Her hands were trembling now that the danger had passed, but her voice remained steady. "Then we make sure they can't find you. Clara, marry me." The words hung in the air between them, surprising them both. Boone stared at her as if she'd spoken in a foreign language. "What? Marry me? Clara repeated, her mind working furiously. Legally. Today, if possible, a married woman has certain protections under territorial law. A married woman can't be forced to testify against her husband. Boone's expression shifted from confusion to understanding. You want to marry me to protect me from the law? I want to marry you because I love you, Clara said, the truth of it hitting her like a physical blow. But yes, the legal protection would be useful. Boone holstered his gun and stepped closer. Clara, you don't know what you're saying. I know exactly what I'm saying. Clara reached up and touched the cameo brooch at her throat, her mother's brooch, worn every day as a reminder of strength and grace under pressure. I know that I'd rather face whatever comes as your wife than spend the rest of my life wondering what might have been. The danger will exist, whether we're married or not. Clara's voice was firm. But marriage gives us legal standing. It makes this ranch legally mine as well as yours. It makes me your next of kin instead of just the woman who happens to live here. Boone was quiet for a long moment, studying her face in the growing daylight. When he spoke, his voice was rough with emotion. You deserve better than a wanted man with blood on his hands. I deserve a man who sees me as an equal partner. Clara stepped closer, close enough to see the gold, flecks in his brown eyes. I deserve a man who trusts me to make my own choices about what I can live with. Boone cupped her face in his hands, his calloused palms gentle against her skin. Are you sure? I've never been more sure of anything in my life. When he kissed her, Clara tasted hope and fear in equal measure, along with the promise of a future. Neither of them had dared to imagine. Clara stood before the mirror in her bedroom, pinning her hair with hands that trembled despite her best efforts to remain calm. In 3 hours, she would be married to a man she'd known for less than 2 months, a man with a price on his head and secrets that could get them both killed. The dress spread across her bed was hardly the wedding gown she'd once imagined. Made from a bolt of deep blue wool she'd found in Thomas McKinnon's trunk. It was practical rather than romantic, with long sleeves and a high collar that would serve her well through the winter months ahead. But Clara had worked late into the night, adding small touches. Mother-of-pearl buttons from her Boston dress, lace trim salvaged from an old petticoat, careful stitching that transformed the simple fabric into something worthy of the occasion. It's beautiful, said Martha Henley, who'd arrived that morning to help with preparations and serve as witness to the ceremony. The older woman's presence had been Boone's idea, a way to ensure the marriage would be recognized by the community, whatever. Challenges lay ahead. It's practical, Clara corrected, though she couldn't hide her pleasure at the compliment, like everything else about this arrangement. Martha's weathered hands were gentle as she helped Clara into the dress. Nothing practical about marrying a wanted man, if you ask me. I didn't ask you. Clara's voice was sharper than she'd intended, betraying the nerves she was trying to conceal. Easy, child. Martha's tone was understanding. I'm not criticizing, just wondering if you've thought this through. Clara turned to face the older woman, seeing genuine concern in her lined features. What would you have me do, Martha? Send him away and wait for Jake Morrison to decide my fate? Hide in town and pray the bounty hunters lose interest? You could come stay with Jim and me until things settle down. Things won't settle down. Not for Boone, and not for me as long as I'm connected to him. Clara smoothed the dress's skirt with careful hands. This way, at least we face whatever comes together. Martha nodded slowly. You love him. It wasn't a question, but Clara answered anyway. Yes. And he loves you? Clara thought of the way Boone looked at her when he thought she wasn't watching, the gentle way he'd touched her face before their first kiss, the protective fury in his eyes when the bounty hunters had threatened her. Yes, she said more softly. I think he does. From the main room came the sound of men's voices, Boone and Reverend Patterson, who'd made the journey from Cedar Falls despite the short notice and dangerous circumstances. The Reverend was a practical man who'd seen enough frontier hardship to know that love sometimes required unusual arrangements. Clara could hear Boone's voice, lower and calmer than it had been since the attack. He was explaining something to the Reverend, probably the legal necessities that made this marriage. More than just romantic impulse. Clara had spent the morning drafting papers that would transfer ownership of the ranch to both their names, creating the legal partnership that might protect them both. A knock at the bedroom door interrupted her thoughts. "Clara?" Boone's voice was careful, respectful. "May I come in?" "Not supposed to see the bride before the wedding," Martha protested, but she was smiling. "I need to give her something," Boone replied. Clara opened the door to find him standing in the hallway, dressed in his finest clothes, a black suit that emphasized his height and the silver at his temples. In his hands was a small wooden box, carved with intricate patterns that spoke of hours of patient work. "I made this for you," he said simply, offering the box. Inside, nestled on a bed of blue velvet, lay a ring, not the elaborate diamond confection Clara might have expected from a man of Boone's wealth, but something far more precious, a band of hammered gold set with a single stone the color of mountain sky. "The stone came from this land," Boone explained as Clara lifted the ring with trembling fingers. "Found it in the stream bed the day after we met. Had it cut and set in Albuquerque." His voice was uncertain, almost shy. "I know it's not much. Compared to what you might have had, it's perfect," Clara whispered, slipping the ring onto her finger. The fit was exact, as if it had been made specifically for her hand, which she realized it had been. "Boone." Clara looked up at him, seeing her own nervous excitement reflected in his eyes. "Are we making a terrible mistake?" "Probably." His smile was tender, transforming his stern features. "But I'd rather make mistakes with you than live safely without you." Martha cleared her throat diplomatically. "Reverend's waiting, and the Jew. Light's fading. If we're doing this, we'd best get started." Clara took one last look in the mirror, seeing a woman she barely recognized, stronger than the one who'd arrived from Boston, braver than the one who'd buried Samuel, more hopeful than she'd ever dared to be. "I'm ready," she said, and meant it with every fiber of her being. As they walked toward the main room where their future waited, Clara felt the weight of the ring on her finger and the lightness of possibility in her heart. The ceremony took place in the main room of the ranch house, where late afternoon light streamed through the windows Clara had mended with her own hands. She'd arranged wildflowers from the hillsides, late-blooming asters and mountain sage that filled the room with the scent of autumn and new beginnings. Reverend Patterson stood before the stone fireplace, his weathered Bible open in his hands, and his expression grave but not unkind. He'd known Thomas McKinnon well enough to appreciate the irony of blessing a marriage in the house where another man had dreamed of the same happiness. "We are gathered here," he began, his voice carrying the weight of many frontier ceremonies performed under difficult circumstances, "to witness the union of Boone Carrigan and Clara Bellamy in the sight of God and this community." Clara stood beside Boone, acutely aware of his steady presence, the way his hand trembled slightly when he took hers. She could feel the ring he'd made for her, warm against her palm, where she held it ready for the exchange of vows. Through the window, she could see the graves of Thomas McKinnon and the 3 bounty hunters, stark reminders of the violence that had brought them to this moment. But there was also the repaired barn, the mended fences, the evidence of their partnership carved into the landscape itself. "Marriage," Reverend Patterson continued, "is not merely a joining of 2 people, but a covenant that transforms both. In the territories, where survival often depends on the strength of such bonds, we understand that marriage must be built on more than romance alone." Martha Henley dabbed at her eyes with a handkerchief, while Jim stood beside her with his hat in his hands, serving as the second required witness. These neighbors who'd known Thomas, who'd warned Clara about the dangers she faced, now stood ready to support her choice. "Boone Carrigan," the Reverend said, turning to face the groom. Do you take Clara Bellamy to be your lawfully wedded wife, to honor and protect her, to share with her your fortune and your fate, for better or worse, in sickness and health, till death do you part? Boone's voice was steady when he answered, though Clara could see the emotion in his eyes. I do, and I promise more than that. He turned to face Clara directly, speaking words that weren't part of the traditional ceremony, but came from his heart. I promise to value your strength, to trust your judgment, to stand beside you as an equal partner in whatever we build together. Clara felt tears prick her eyes at the unexpected addition. These were the words she'd hoped to hear from Samuel, the recognition she'd craved but never received. Clara Bellamy, Reverend Patterson said, his voice gentler now. Do you take Boone Carrigan to be your lawfully wedded husband, to honor and support him, to share with him your life and your love, for better or worse, in sickness and health, till death do you part? Clara looked into Boone's eyes, seeing the man who'd given her refuge when she had nowhere to go, who'd worked beside her to rebuild this place, who'd trusted her with his secrets and his fears. The words she'd rehearsed seemed inadequate for the magnitude of what she felt. I do, she said clearly, and I promise to face whatever comes without fear, to build something lasting with you, to be the partner you deserve and the woman I've always wanted to be. The ring exchange was simple but profound. Boone's hands were steady as he slipped the gold band onto Clara's finger, the stone catching the afternoon light like captured sky. The ring Clara had bought for him in Cedar Falls was plain gold, but she'd had it engraved with a single word: partner. By the authority vested in me by the territory of New Mexico, Reverend Patterson said, closing his Bible with a gentle snap, I now pronounce you husband and wife. What God has joined together, let no man put asunder. When Boone kissed her, Clara tasted hope and determination in equal measure. This wasn't the desperate kiss they'd shared after her proposal, but something deeper, a sealing of promises made and futures chosen. Martha wept openly now, while Jim cleared his throat and mumbled something about needing a drink. Reverend Patterson shook both their hands with the satisfaction of a man who'd seen genuine love blessed despite difficult circumstances. As the sun set over the mountains, painting the ranch in shades of gold and amber, Clara and Boone stood together on the porch they'd repaired with their own hands. The marriage certificate bore their signatures in black ink, legal proof of the partnership that had been growing between them since the day they'd first shaken hands over a shared determination to save this place. Mrs. Carrigan, Boone said, softly, testing the sound of her new name. Mr. Carrigan, Clara replied, surprised by how right it felt. That night, as they shared their first meal as husband and wife, Clara understood that she'd gained more than legal protection or even love. She'd gained the partnership she'd always dreamed of, two people choosing to face the world together, equals in hope and determination. Outside, the wind carried the promise of winter, but inside their home, surrounded by the evidence of their shared work and commitment, Clara felt only warmth. The letter arrived 6 days after the wedding, delivered by a nervous boy from Cedar Falls who refused to come closer than the main gate. Clara found it tied to the fence post with a black ribbon, her name written across the envelope in elegant script that somehow made the contents more ominous than crude threats would have. She carried the letter inside, where Boone was cleaning, his rifle at the kitchen table, a daily ritual since the bounty hunter's attack. The domestic scene felt surreal, given the menace radiating from the paper in her hands. What is it? Boone asked, noticing her expression. Clara broke the wax seal and unfolded heavy paper that bore the embossed letterhead of Morrison Cattle Company. The message was brief, almost cordial in its politeness. My dear Mrs. Carrigan, allow me to congratulate you on your recent marriage. I'm certain you and Mr. Carrigan will be very happy together for whatever time you have remaining. I find myself in the awkward position of having business with your husband regarding a matter that predates your charming union. 3 associates, of mine met with misfortune near Tombstone some months ago. While the law has proven inadequate in addressing this tragedy, I prefer to handle such matters personally. I believe Mr. Carrigan will understand my meaning. I will call upon you both at your convenience to discuss appropriate compensation for my loss. I trust we can reach an arrangement that satisfies all parties. Your most humble servant, Jake Morrison, P.S. I've taken the liberty of ensuring your neighbors understand the delicate nature of our upcoming negotiations. I would hate for anyone to interfere in what should remain a private matter. Boone read the letter twice, his expression growing darker with each word. When he finished, he set the paper on the table and stared at it, as if it might burst into flames. The men in Tombstone, Clara said quietly. They worked for Morrison. Yes. Boone's voice was flat, devoid of emotion. I should have known. Morrison's reach extends further than I thought. You killed his men in self-defense. Surely, Morrison doesn't care about self-defense. He cares about reputation, about making sure no one thinks they can cross him without consequences. Boone stood and walked to the window, scanning the horizon with practiced wariness. The bounty hunters were just the opening move. This is the real game. Clara felt ice settle in her stomach. What does he want? Me. Dead or broken doesn't matter. Which? Boone turned back to her, and Clara saw the weight of old fears in his eyes. Morrison's the kind of man who owns judges and sheriffs, who can make evidence disappear or appear as needed. He's untouchable through legal channels. But you're married to me now. The ranch is legally protected, Clara. Boone's voice was gentle but firm. Morrison killed Thomas McKinnon for refusing to sell this land. Do you think marriage certificates will stop him from doing the same to us? The truth of that statement hit Clara like a physical blow. She'd been so focused on protecting Boone from federal marshals and bounty hunters that she'd almost forgotten about the original threat. The man who'd murdered her intended husband and would think nothing of murdering her actual one. There's more, Boone said, producing a second piece of paper from his pocket. Pete Garrison brought this when he delivered supplies yesterday. The document was a legal notice, signed by the territorial judge in Albuquerque, freezing all assets related to the Carrigan criminal enterprise pending investigation into allegations of murder and cattle rustling. Clara's hands shook as she read the charges, all carefully worded to suggest guilt without requiring proof. Morrison's bought himself a judge, she said, and probably a sheriff, a prosecutor, and whoever else he needs. Boone's smile was bitter. The marriage that was supposed to protect us has made us both targets. As my wife, you're now implicated in my alleged crimes. Clara set down the papers and walked to where Boone stood by the window. Outside, their ranch spread in the afternoon sunlight. The barn they'd repaired, the fences they'd mended, the life they'd built together through hope and hard work. So what do? She asked. We run. Tonight, before he arrives with enough men to make running impossible. Run where? He has the law on his side now. He can track us anywhere in the territory. Mexico, maybe. Or California. Boone's voice lacked conviction. Somewhere far enough away that Morrison's influence doesn't reach. Clara was quiet for a long moment, weighing their options against the life they'd fought to build. Finally, she shook her head. No, Clara, no. She turned to face him fully, and Boone saw something new in her eyes. Not just determination, but a fierce anger that transformed her completely. I've run enough. From Boston, from poverty, from fear. I won't run from this. Morrison has everything. Money, men, legal authority. We have nothing. We have each other. Clara moved closer, placing her hands on his chest. We have this land that we've bled for. And we have one thing Morrison doesn't expect. What's that? Clara's smile was sharp as a blade. A woman with nothing left to lose. Clara spent the first hour after reading Morrison's letter walking the ranch boundaries, her mind working with a clarity that surprised her. Fear had a way of sharpening focus, she discovered, stripping away everything unnecessary until only the essential remained. And what was essential was simple. She would not lose this home to a man who thought power made him untouchable. She returned to the house. She found Boone cleaning weapons with methodical precision. His Winchester rifle lay disassembled on the kitchen table, each part inspected and oiled. A box of ammunition sat open beside it, cartridges arranged in neat rows like golden soldiers preparing for war. "How many men will he bring?" Clara asked, settling into the chair across from him. "Enough." Boone's hands never paused in their work. "Morrison doesn't take chances. If he's coming personally, he'll bring overwhelming force. 6 men, 10, could be 20. Boone looked up, his eyes holding the hard knowledge of a man who'd survived too many fights. "Clara, this isn't like the bounty hunters. Those were desperate men looking for easy money. Morrison's riders are professionals. They've done this before." Clara nodded, absorbing this information without flinching. "Then we need to be smarter than they are. We need to be gone before they arrive." "No." Clara's voice was final. "This ends here." Boone set down the rifle barrel and studied her face. "You understand what that means, what we're choosing. I understand that running means Morrison wins. He takes our land, our home, everything we've built." Clara leaned forward, her hands flat on the table. "I understand that if we fight and lose, we die. But if we run and get caught, we die anyway. At least this way, we die for something that matters. And if we fight and win, then we live free or we don't live at all." Boone was quiet for a long moment, then nodded slowly. "Tell me your plan." Clara had been thinking about their advantages during her walk, cataloguing everything that might help them survive what was coming. The ranch sat in a natural bowl, which could be a trap or a fortress depending on how they used it. The house was built solid, with thick adobe walls that would stop most bullets, and they had something Morrison's men wouldn't expect: intimate knowledge of every inch of their land. "Morrison will come from the main trail," Clara said, tracing routes on the table with her finger. "It's the only way to bring horses and men in force. That means we see them coming from a mile away. Good for early warning. Bad when they surround. The house. We don't fight from the house." Clara's eyes met his. "We fight from the high ground." She explained her thinking. Morrison's men would expect to find them barricaded inside, waiting to be starved out or burned out. Instead, they would take positions in the rocks above the ranch, where they could control the approaches and make every shot count. "It's risky," Boone said when she finished. "If they split up, come at us from multiple directions, then we use the land against them. I've spent weeks walking these hills, Boone. I know every game trail, every hiding place." Clara's voice carried quiet conviction. "This is our ground. We make them fight on our terms." They spent the remaining daylight preparing. Boone showed Clara how to load and aim the rifle properly, correcting her stance and breathing until she could hit a tin can at 100 yards. She was a natural shot, he discovered, steady hands and good eyes, with the patience to wait for the right moment. "You've done this before," he observed, after she put 3 bullets through the center of their makeshift target. "Hunting rabbits. With my father when I was young." Clara worked the rifle's action smoothly, ejecting the spent cartridge. "He said a woman should know how to feed her family if the men couldn't." Smart man. He was. Said independence was the only thing one could take from you. Clara lowered the rifle and looked at Boone directly. "I think he'd approve of what we're doing." As evening approached, they moved supplies to their chosen position, a cluster of boulders that commanded the main approach while offering multiple escape routes. Water, ammunition, food for several days if needed. Clara wrapped everything in oilcloth against the mountain weather, thinking with dark humor that she was planning for a siege as carefully as she'd once planned dinner parties in Boston. "Morrison will probably offer to talk first," Boone said, as they settled in to wait. "Try to negotiate, make it seem reasonable. What do we tell him?" "Nothing." The time for talking ended when he killed Thomas. Boone checked his pistol one final time, then holstered it. "Whatever he says, whatever he offers, remember that this man murders people who stand in his way." Clara nodded, her hand moving instinctively. to touch the Winchester's stock. The rifle felt heavy in her hands, weighted with the knowledge of what she might have to do with it. But it also felt like protection, like power in a world that had given her precious little of either. "Boone," she said quietly as the first stars appeared overhead. "Yes, I love you. Whatever happens tomorrow, I want you to know that." His kiss was gentle in the darkness, tasting of promises and farewells. Jake Morrison arrived with the dawn, leading a column of 12 riders down the main trail like a general approaching a conquered city. Clara watched from the rocks above, her rifle steady in her hands as the procession moved with deliberate menace through the valley she'd come to call home. Morrison himself rode at the front, a large man with silver hair and expensive clothes that marked him as someone accustomed to having others do his fighting. But Clara could see the gun on his hip and the easy way he sat his horse, suggesting he was more than just a wealthy rancher playing at war. Behind him rode men who made the bounty hunters look like amateurs. These were professional killers, Clara realized, studying their movements through the rifle's sights. They spread out automatically as they approached the ranch house, covering all angles, moving with the coordination of a military unit. "Carrigan!" Morrison's voice carried clearly in the thin mountain air. "I've come to talk. Bring your wife and let's settle this like civilized men." Boone lay beside Clara among the boulders, his own rifle trained on the group below. "He's wearing a badge," he murmured, squinting through the scope. Clara shifted her position to get a better view. Sure enough, a silver star glinted on Morrison's vest, probably from some bought judge, giving him the appearance of legal authority. "Federal Marshal," Morrison called out, confirming Clara's suspicions. "I have warrants for the arrest of Boone Carrigan on charges of murder and cattle rustling. Come out peacefully, and the woman won't be harmed." "Lying bastard," Boone said quietly. "That badge is as fake as his warrants." Two of Morrison's men dismounted and approached the house, weapons drawn. Clara watched them kick in the front door. She'd repaired with her own hands, disappearing inside to search rooms that held her few precious possessions and the life she'd tried to build. "Nobody home, Mr. Morrison," one of them called out after several minutes. Morrison's expression darkened. He'd expected to find them cowering inside, Clara realized, waiting to be captured or killed at his convenience. The fact that they'd chosen to fight was clearly an unwelcome surprise. "Spread out," Morrison ordered. "They can't have gone far. Check the barn, the outbuildings, find them." Clara felt Boone tense beside her as the riders began moving through their property, trampling the vegetable garden she'd planted, kicking over the water troughs they'd repaired. These men were destroying everything she and Boone had worked to create, and the sight filled her with cold fury. "Wait," Boone whispered as Clara's finger moved toward her rifle's trigger. "Let them bunch up. Make every shot count." One of the riders approached their position, following what might have been a trail up into the rocks. Clara could see his face clearly now. Young, maybe 20, with the hard eyes of someone who'd killed before. She centered the rifle's sights on his chest and held her breath. "Now," Boone said. Clara's shot took the young gunman in the shoulder, spinning him from his saddle with a cry of pain and surprise. Boone's bullet found another target, and suddenly the morning erupted in gunfire and shouting. Morrison's men scattered, seeking cover behind buildings and rocks, returning fire at the positions they thought they'd identified. But Clara and Boone were already moving, using the network of game trails Clara had memorized to relocate before their enemies could pinpoint them. "God damn it!" Morrison roared, his cultured veneer cracking under stress. "Kill them both! Burn the place down if you have to!" Clara felt something hot and vicious rise in her chest. This man had murdered Thomas McKinnon, threatened her neighbors, corrupted the law itself to serve his greed. Now he wanted to destroy everything she held dear, simply because she'd refused to surrender. She moved to a new position and found another target. One of Morrison's men trying to circle behind their original hiding place. This shot was harder, at greater distance, but Clara's hands were steady as stone. The man dropped his rifle and stumbled backward, clutching a wounded arm. "Jesus Christ!" Morrison shouted. "Where are they shooting from?" "Multiple positions," someone called back. "They're moving around us." Clara smiled grimly. Her strategy was working. Morrison's men had expected a siege, not a running battle against opponents who knew every rock and tree. They were being picked apart by an enemy they couldn't pin down, and their discipline was starting to crack. But the fight was far from over. Morrison still had 10 men to their 2, and desperation could make even professional killers reckless. As Clara reloaded her rifle, she saw 3 riders breaking away from the main group, trying to flank their position from the west. "Boone," she called softly. "I see them." His voice was calm, deadly. "Take the one on the left. I'll handle the others." Clara nestled the rifle stock against her shoulder and found her target in the sights. The man was young, probably not much older than she'd been when she married Samuel. For a moment, she hesitated. Then she thought of Thomas McKinnon's grave, of Morrison's threatening letter, of everything these men represented. Clara Bellamy Carrigan pulled the trigger and became someone she'd never imagined she could be. The battle raged for 3 hours under the merciless New Mexico sun. Clara lost count of her shots after the first dozen, her world narrowing to the rhythm of aim, fire, move, reload. Bodies littered the ranch yard, some moving, some still, all testament to the price of Jake Morrison's greed. By noon, only Morrison and 3 of his men remained alive and fighting. The others lay scattered across the property like broken dolls, victims of Clara and Boone's intimate knowledge of their land and their desperate determination to keep it. "Enough!" Morrison finally roared, his voice hoarse with rage and frustration. "Carrigan, show yourself or I start burning buildings." Clara watched from her position in the rocks as Morrison pulled a torch from his saddlebag and rode toward the barn. The threat was real. He would destroy everything they'd built rather than admit defeat. The thought of losing the home she'd fought so hard to claim sent ice through Clara's veins. "Clara!" Boone's voice came from 20 yards away, where he'd taken cover behind a fallen log. "He's trying to draw us out. Don't let him provoke you." But Clara was already moving, rage overriding caution as Morrison approached the barn with his torch held high. This building represented more than shelter. It was where she'd first seen Boone working with gentle hands, where they'd stored feed for the animals, where they'd planned to house the horses they'd breed together. "You want me, Morrison?" Clara called out, rising from behind the rocks with her rifle trained on his chest. "Here I am." Morrison reined in his horse, surprise flickering across his weathered features. He'd expected Boone, not the woman who'd married into this mess. His torch wavered as he studied Clara's face, seeing something there that gave him pause. "Mrs. Carrigan," he said, his voice resuming its false courtesy, "surely we can reach an accommodation. A woman of your obvious intelligence must see that further resistance is futile. I see a murderer who killed my intended husband and now wants to steal my home." Clara's voice was steady, though her heart hammered against her ribs. "I see a coward who hides behind bought badges and hired guns." Morrison's face darkened. "That husband of yours killed 3 of my men in cold blood. Justice demands payment. Your men tried to cheat him at cards, then threatened to shoot him when he called them on it." Clara had heard the real story from witnesses in Cedar Falls, people too afraid of Morrison to testify, but willing to whisper the truth. "Boone defended himself against murderers. The only injustice is that you weren't there to die with them." "Careful, woman. You're talking to a federal marshal." Clara laughed, the sound sharp as breaking glass. "You're talking to a woman with nothing left to lose. That badge is as fake as your authority." Morrison's hand moved toward his gun, but Clara's rifle was already aimed at his heart. At this distance, she couldn't miss, and they both knew it. "Drop the torch," she commanded. "Or, what, you'll shoot an officer of the law?" "I'll shoot a murderer wearing a stolen badge." Clara's finger tightened on the trigger. "Drop it. Now." For a moment Morrison hesitated. Then he smiled, a cold expression that held no humor, only malice. "You know what your real problem is. Mrs. Carrigan, You still think this is about law and justice? It's not. It's about power, and I have more of it than you ever will." Morrison dropped the torch. Not onto the ground, but directly onto a pile of hay beside the barn door. Flames leaped instantly to life, spreading with terrifying speed across the dry wood of the building Clara and Boone had worked so hard to repair. Clara's shot took Morrison in the chest, punching him backward from his saddle to land in the dust of the ranch yard. But the damage was done. The barn was already engulfed in flames, and the wind was carrying sparks toward the house. "Clara!" Boone's shout came from behind her as Morrison's surviving men opened fire, forcing her to dive for cover as bullets chipped rock around her position. She rolled behind a boulder, her mind racing. The fire was spreading faster than they could fight it, and Morrison's men were using the distraction to advance on their positions. In minutes, they would be overrun, killed, and everything they'd built would burn to ash, unless she made a different choice. Clara reached into her jacket and withdrew the deed Boone had signed, making her sole owner of the ranch. Insurance against exactly this situation. The paper was warm from her body heat, the ink still fresh from yesterday's preparation. She understood now what queenship really meant. It wasn't about being chosen or protected. It was about choosing, even when the choices were terrible. "Boone!" she called out. "The creek! Fall back to the creek!" As she moved toward their final defensive position, Clara made the hardest decision of her life. She would save the man she loved, even if it meant sacrificing everything else. The battle raged for 3 hours under the merciless New Mexico sun. Clara lost count of her shots after the first dozen, her world narrowing to the rhythm of aim, fire, move, reload. Bodies littered the ranch yard, some moving, some still, all testament to the price of Jake Morrison's greed. By noon, only Morrison and 3 of his men remained alive and fighting. The others lay scattered across the property like broken dolls, victims of Clara and Boone's intimate knowledge of their land and their desperate determination to keep it. "Enough!" Morrison finally roared, his voice hoarse with rage and frustration. "Carrigan, show yourself or I start burning buildings." Clara watched from her position in the rocks as Morrison pulled a torch from his saddlebag and rode toward the barn. The threat was real. He would destroy everything they'd built rather than admit defeat. The thought of losing the home she'd fought so hard to claim sent ice through Clara's veins. "Clara." Boone's voice came from 20 yards away, where he'd taken cover behind a fallen log. "He's trying to draw us out. Don't let him provoke you." But Clara was already moving, rage overriding caution as Morrison approached the barn with his torch held high. This building represented more than shelter. It was where she'd first seen Boone working with gentle hands, where they'd stored feed for the animals, where they'd planned to house the horses they'd breed together. "You want me, Morrison?" Clara called out, rising from behind the rocks with her rifle trained on his chest. "Here I am." Morrison reined in his horse, surprise flickering across his weathered features. He'd expected Boone, not the woman who'd married into this mess. His torch wavered as he studied Clara's face, seeing something there that gave him pause. "Mrs. Carrigan," he said, his voice resuming its false courtesy, "surely we can reach an accommodation. A woman of your obvious intelligence must see that further resistance is futile. I see a murderer who killed my intended husband and now wants to steal my home." Clara's voice was steady, though her heart hammered against her ribs. "I see a coward who hides behind bought badges and hired guns." Morrison's face darkened. "That husband of yours killed 3 of my men in cold blood. Justice demands payment. Your men tried to cheat him at cards, then threatened to shoot him when he called them on it." Clara had heard the real story from witnesses in Cedar Falls, people too afraid of Morrison to testify, but willing to whisper the truth. "Boone defended himself against murderers. The only injustice is that you weren't there to die with them." "Careful, woman. You're talking to a federal marshal." Clara laughed, the sound sharp as breaking glass. "You're talking to a woman with Nothing left to lose. That badge is as fake as your authority. Morrison's hand moved toward his gun, but Clara's rifle was already aimed at his heart. At this distance, she couldn't miss, and they both knew it. "Drop the torch," she commanded. "Or, what, you'll shoot an officer of the law?" "I'll shoot a murderer wearing a stolen badge." Clara's finger tightened on the trigger. "Drop it. Now." For a moment, Morrison hesitated. Then he smiled, a cold expression that held no humor, only malice. "You know what your real problem is. Mrs. Carrigan, you still think this is about law and justice. It's not. It's about power, and I have more of it than you ever will." Morrison dropped the torch, not onto the ground, but directly onto a pile of hay beside the barn door. Flames leapt instantly to life, spreading with terrifying speed across the dry wood of the building Clara and Boone had worked so hard to repair. Clara's shot took Morrison in the chest, punching him backward from his saddle to land in the dust of the ranch yard. But the damage was done. The barn was already engulfed in flames, and the wind was carrying sparks toward the house. "Clara!" Boone's shout came from behind her as Morrison's surviving men opened fire, forcing her to dive for cover as bullets chipped rock around her position. She rolled behind a boulder, her mind racing. The fire was spreading faster than they could fight it, and Morrison's men were using the distraction to advance on their positions. In minutes, they would be overrun, killed, and everything they'd built would burn to ash, unless she made a different choice. Clara reached into her jacket and withdrew the deed Boone had signed, making her sole owner of the ranch. Insurance against exactly this situation. The paper was warm from her body heat, the ink still fresh from yesterday's preparation. She understood now what queenship really meant. It wasn't about being chosen or protected. It was about choosing, even when the choices were terrible. "Boone!" she called out. "The creek! Fall back to the creek!" As she moved toward their final defensive position, Clara made the hardest decision of her life. She would save the man she loved, even if it meant sacrificing everything else. The fire burned for 2 days before the November rains finally extinguished. The last smoldering embers. Clara stood in the ruins of what had been their barn, soot-stained and hollow-eyed, surveying the damage with the methodical assessment of someone who'd learned to measure loss without drowning in it. Half their buildings were gone, the barn, the chicken coop, and part of the house's east wall. But the well still ran clear, the fences still stood, and the land itself remained untouched by Morrison's rage. More importantly, she and Boone had survived when 12 men had come to kill them. "Could have been worse," Boone said quietly, joining her in the blackened ruins. His left arm hung in a sling from a bullet that had found its mark during the final minutes of fighting. But he was alive, and that was enough. "Could have been better," Clara replied, though without bitterness. She'd made her choice by the creek, trading buildings for lives, and she wouldn't question it now. The territorial sheriff had arrived the day after the battle, drawn by reports of gunfire and smoke visible from 20 miles away. Sheriff Coleman was an honest man, Clara discovered, one of the few lawmen Morrison hadn't been able to buy or intimidate. He'd listened to their story with growing amazement, examined the fake badge on Morrison's body, and declared the entire affair a clear case of self-defense against armed criminals. "Morrison's been playing judge, jury, and executioner in this territory for too long," Coleman had said, tipping his hat to Clara with genuine respect. About time someone stood up to him. The legal complications had sorted themselves out with surprising speed. Morrison's board judge in Albuquerque suddenly developed a convenient memory loss about warrants and frozen assets when faced with testimony from a dozen witnesses willing to speak freely now that their tormentor was dead. The charges against Boone evaporated like morning mist, leaving them free to rebuild without looking over their shoulders. But it was the community's response that truly surprised Clara. Within a week of the battle, wagons began arriving from Cedar Falls and the surrounding ranches. Neighbors who'd been too frightened to help before Morrison's death now came bearing lumber, tools, and strong backs ready for work. Figure it's the least we can do, Jim Henley said, unloading boards from his wagon. Should have stood up to Morrison years ago instead of leaving it to you folks. Martha Henley arrived with 3 other women, their arms full of food and their faces determined. Men can rebuild buildings, she announced. Women rebuild lives. Clara found herself accepting help with a grace that would have been impossible 6 months earlier. The frightened woman who'd stepped off the mail wagon had been transformed by necessity and choice into someone who could stand beside her husband as an equal, who could face down killers and make the hard decisions that survival demanded. As they worked together to raise new walls where the old ones had fallen, Clara began to understand something she'd never grasped during her years in Boston. Community wasn't just about proximity or shared interests. It was about standing together when the darkness came, about choosing to help instead of hiding when neighbors faced impossible odds. "You've changed," Boone observed one evening as they sat on their rebuilt porch watching the sunset paint the mountains in shades of gold and amber. "We both have," Clara replied, her hand finding his despite the distance between their chairs. "Do you regret any of it? The choice to stay, to fight?" Clara considered the question seriously. She thought of Thomas McKinnon's grave, marked now, with a proper stone that bore his name and dates, along with the simple inscription, "He tried to do right." She thought of the ashes of their barn, the bullet holes still visible in the adobe walls, the memories of violence that would always shadow this place. But she also thought of the seed packets Martha had brought her, vegetables and flowers for next spring's planting. She thought of the foal growing in their mare's belly, Boone's careful breeding program finally beginning to bear fruit. She thought of the way he looked at her now, not as a woman to be protected, but as a partner who'd proven herself in the crucible of shared danger. "I regret the violence," she said finally. "I regret that Morrison gave us no choice, but I don't regret staying. I don't regret fighting for what we built together, even though it cost us so much." Clara turned to study her husband's profile in the fading light. The silver at his temples was more pronounced now, and new lines marked his face, evidence of the weight they'd both carried through those dark weeks. But his eyes still held the warmth that had first drawn her to him, and his hands still moved with the gentle competence she'd learned to trust. "It didn't cost us what mattered most," she said simply. That night, as they lay in their bed in the partially rebuilt house, Clara listened to Boone's steady breathing and felt something she'd never experienced before, the deep satisfaction of someone who'd fought for what they wanted and won, not through luck or inheritance, but through courage and partnership. She was Clara Carrigan now, no longer the desperate mail-order bride or the grateful widow, but a woman who'd chosen her own crown. Spring arrived early in the valley, painting the hillsides with wildflowers and filling the air with the promise of new beginnings. Clara stood in her garden, 6 months pregnant and glowing with the kind of contentment she'd never thought possible, watching Boone gentle a young colt in the rebuilt corral. The letter from her sister Margaret had arrived with the morning mail, carried by Pete Garrison, who now made his deliveries with a smile instead of nervous glances toward the hills. Clara held the paper carefully, still amazed by Margaret's words, even after reading them 3 times. "Dearest Clara," the letter began, "your last correspondence left us speechless. When you wrote of finding love again in such dangerous circumstances, Mother and I feared for your safety and sanity in equal measure. But your description of your life there, of the partnership you've built with Mr. Carrigan, fills me with admiration and perhaps a touch of envy. You sound like a different person than the timid widow who left Boston nearly a year ago. There's strength in your words now, confidence in your choices that I remember from our girlhood, but thought lost forever after Samuel's death. Whatever hardships you've faced in that wilderness, they've transformed you into the woman you were, always meant to be." Clara smiled, thinking of the frightened creature who'd stepped off Pete's wagon so many months ago. That woman had been running from life, seeking safety in the arms of a stranger who'd promised her nothing more than partnership and respect. She'd found both, along with love, deeper than anything she'd known with Samuel or even James. The sound of approaching horses drew her attention to the main trail, where 3 riders were coming down from the pass. Clara felt her hand move instinctively toward the rifle she still kept within reach. Old habits dying hard, but these were neighbors. The Hendersons from the spread to the north, come calling with news, and probably hoping for an invitation to dinner. "Mrs. Carrigan," Tom Henderson called out, tipping his hat as he approached the garden fence. "Hope you don't mind the intrusion." "Not at all, Tom. Sarah, how lovely to see you." Clara wiped dirt from her hands and walked toward the fence, noting how the other woman's eyes lingered on her growing belly with the warm approval of someone who understood the miracle of new life in hard country. "We brought news," Sarah Henderson said, practically glowing with excitement. "The territorial governor's appointed a new judge for this district, a real one this time, not some puppet Morrison could buy. And they're talking about running a railroad spur up through the valley," Tom added, "bring commerce and civilization to these parts." Clara felt a complex mix of emotions at this news. Civilization meant safety, law, order, all things she'd once craved. But it also meant change, the loss of the wild freedom that had allowed her to become who she was meant to be. "That's wonderful news," she said, meaning it despite her reservations. "There's more," Sarah continued, leaning forward conspiratorially. "Judge Campbell's asked Boone to serve as territorial marshal for the district. Musim's word of what you two did to Morrison has reached all the way to Santa Fe." Clara looked toward the corral where Boone was working, seeing him with new eyes. A year ago, he'd been a wanted man, hunted by bounty hunters and federal marshals. Now he was being offered a badge of his own, recognition that his actions had been not just justified, but heroic. "What did he say?" Clara asked. "Said he'd need to discuss it with his partner," Tom replied with a grin. "Told the judge he didn't make important decisions without consulting his wife." Clara felt warmth spread through her chest at those words. Partner, wife, equal voice in shaping their future. These were gifts beyond price, recognition of the woman she'd fought to become. After the Hendersons left, Clara found Boone in the barn, brushing down the colt he'd been training. The building was new, larger than the one Morrison's men had burned, with proper stalls and a hayloft that would see them through the hardest winters. "So," she said, leaning against the stall door, "Marshal Carrigan has a nice ring to it." Boone looked up, his eyes searching her face. "What do you think? It would mean travel, danger, time away from the ranch. It would also mean helping other people the way Sheriff Coleman helped us, making sure what happened to Thomas doesn't happen to anyone else. And you'd be comfortable with that?" "The risks?" Clara placed her hand on her swelling belly, feeling the flutter of new life beneath her palm. Their child would be born into a world they'd helped make safer, raised in a home they'd defended with their own blood and courage. "I married a man who stands up to bullies and protects people who can't protect themselves," she said simply. "I wouldn't want you to change that now." Boone set down the brush and crossed to where she stood, pulling her into his arms with the careful tenderness of a man aware of the precious cargo she carried. "Have I mentioned lately that I love you, Clara Carrigan?" "Not since this morning." Clara stood on her toes to kiss him, tasting hope and promise on his lips. "But I never get tired of hearing it." 1 year later, Clara stood on the hill overlooking the valley that had become her kingdom, watching the sun set behind mountains that no longer seemed wild and threatening, but protective and eternal. In her arms, baby Thomas, named for the man whose dreams had brought her here, slept peacefully, his tiny fist curled against her shoulder. Below, the ranch spread like a testament to what determined hearts could build. The new barn stood twice, the size of the old one, filled with horses that bore the Carrigan brand and the reputation for quality that stretched across 3 territories. The house had been expanded to include a proper parlor and 2 additional bedrooms, one of which now served as a nursery painted yellow as sunshine. But it was the wooden sign hanging from the gate that made Clara smile every time she saw it. And carved by Boone during the long winter evenings when she'd been too pregnant to venture far from the fire, it bore simple words that carried the weight of all they'd accomplished. Carrigan Ranch, SJ1887, partners in all things. There you are. Boone's voice came from behind her, warm with affection and relief. I was beginning to think you'd decided to spend the night under the stars. Clara turned to see her husband approaching, his marshal's badge catching the last light of day. He'd worn it for 6 months now, bringing justice to a territory that had known too little of it. The work was dangerous, often taking him away for weeks at a time, but Clara had learned to manage the ranch in his absence with a competence that surprised even her. "Just thinking," she said, shifting the baby to make room for Boone's arm around her waist. "About what?" Clara looked down at the valley one more time, seeing not just what was, but what would be. The railroad would arrive next spring, bringing with it new settlers, new opportunities, new challenges. Their son would grow up in a world more civilized than the one that had forged his parents, but Clara hoped he would inherit their strength and determination nonetheless. "About queens," she said finally. Boone's laugh was soft, understanding. "Still thinking about that, are you? I used to think being a queen meant being chosen, protected, placed on a pedestal to be admired." Clara's voice carried the wisdom of someone who'd learned life's lessons the hard way. "I thought it meant having power given to you by someone else. And now I know that being a queen means choosing your own crown, fighting for your own kingdom, earning your place through courage and determination." Clara looked up at her husband, seeing the pride and love in his eyes. "It means being a partner, not a possession." Below them, lights began to flicker on in the windows of their home. Martha Henley was there tonight, helping with dinner and probably spoiling baby Thomas beyond all reason. The Hendersons would arrive soon for their weekly meal together, part of the community that had grown around the ranch like a protective embrace. "Any regrets?" Boone asked, the question he posed every evening, as if still amazed by the life they'd built together. Clara considered the question seriously, as she always did. She thought of the frightened widow who'd answered Thomas McKinnon's advertisement, seeking nothing more than safety and respectability. She thought of the desperate woman who'd refused to leave an abandoned ranch, too stubborn to admit defeat. She thought of the fierce fighter who'd stood her ground against impossible odds and emerged victorious. "Only one," she said finally. "What's that? I regret that Thomas McKinnon never got to see what we built here. He would have been proud." Boone's arm tightened around her waist. "I think he knows. Some things are too big to be stopped by death." As they walked back toward the house together, Clara Carrigan, mail-order bride turned ranch owner, victim turned victor, woman turned queen, felt the deep satisfaction of someone who'd chosen her own destiny and made it magnificent. The sign above their gate creaked gently in the evening breeze, its carved words a promise kept and a future claimed. "Partners in all things." And in the growing darkness of the New Mexico night, their kingdom glowed with the light of love freely given and fiercely defended.